In a quiet neighborhood diner, a young waiter named Daniel spent every afternoon helping an old woman who sat alone with her fading notebook. He carried her tray, pulled out her chair, and treated her like someone who mattered in a world that had forgotten her. But one ordinary lunch hour, she didn't show up. Instead, four bodyguards walked in, followed by two lawyers asking for Daniel by name. Helping her had always felt like kindness. He had no idea it was changing his destiny, and what they told him next turned his entire life upside down. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Daniel Reyes never thought of himself as extraordinary. He was just a waiter in a cozy neighborhood restaurant, the kind with scratched wooden tables and the constant clatter of plates drifting through the air like background music. But every day, right at 12:15, something shifted in the rhythm of his shift. The door would open, letting in a brief gust of outside air, and Mrs. Alara Finch would walk in, slowly, carefully, as if her bones remembered a life much heavier than the small frame she carried now. She always chose the same corner table, tucked near the window where light fell gently across her hands. And she always ordered the same thing, the vegetable soup, warm bread, and a cup of chamomile tea. Daniel noticed the little things first. How she gripped her purse strap with trembling fingers. How she paused before lowering herself into the chair, calculating every movement. How she smiled at him with quiet gratitude when he carried her tray so she wouldn't have to. None of it felt like work. It felt like instinct, bringing her water before she asked, adjusting the chair so she didn't struggle, learning the pace of her days the way you learn a familiar song, through repetition, through care, through presence. And although her routine never changed, something about it always felt like it meant more than what he could see. Like there was a story sitting across from him every afternoon, waiting to be told. Daniel couldn't help noticing the patterns within the patterns. Little mysteries tucked inside Alara's otherwise simple routine. She always ate alone, even though she carried herself like someone who once hosted rooms full of people. She dressed modestly, almost plainly, but her tips were far more generous than her appearance suggested. And then there was the old leather notebook she kept beside her bowl of soup, its edges worn soft by years of being opened, closed, and carried through life. She never let anyone touch it. Sometimes she wrote in it with slow, thoughtful strokes. Other times she simply rested her hand on it, as if guarding a memory. Their conversations were never long, but they carried a kind of gentle weight. She'd ask Daniel how his day was going, but her questions dug deeper than small talk. "Are you still painting in the evenings?" she'd ask, even though he couldn't recall telling her. Or, "Your mother must be proud of how you carry yourself." He'd laugh and shake his head, wondering how she picked up so much from so little. Every interaction made her feel less like a customer and more like someone who understood him in ways he hadn't shared. And yet, the more he learned about her, the more he realized how little he actually knew. That notebook, those tips, the way she looked at him sometimes as if measuring something invisible. It all hinted that her quiet routine held secrets he hadn't even thought to question. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of slow, uneventful afternoon when the restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the scent of freshly baked bread drifted lazily through the air. Daniel was wiping down a table, half listening to the kitchen radio, when the door swung open with a force that didn't match the room's calm. 4 men in dark suits stepped inside, scanning the diner with the sharp precision of people who were never anywhere by accident. Their presence sliced through the atmosphere. Customers stopped mid-bite, forks hovered, voices died. Behind them, 2 attorneys entered, carrying leather briefcases and an air of urgency. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest, expecting them to address the manager, but their eyes locked straight onto him. "Daniel Reyes?" the older attorney asked. His name sounded out of place here, too formal, too deliberate. Daniel nodded slowly, glancing behind them instinctively, almost expecting Mrs. Finch to shuffle in after them with her soft smile. But her corner table was empty. The absence hit him before the words did. "I'm afraid we bring difficult news," the attorney continued, voice respectful but firm. "Mrs. Alara Finch passed away yesterday, and she left something for you." The room seemed to tilt. Daniel felt the floor loosen beneath him. Shock, disbelief, a sting in his chest he couldn't quite name. Mrs. Finch? Gone? People were watching, whispering, but the attorneys remained unshaken. "We need you to come with us," the younger one added. She left instructions. Before he fully understood what was happening, the bodyguards closed in gently but decisively, guiding him toward the door, toward the black SUV waiting outside, its engine already running. The SUV moved through the city like it had a destination far bigger than anything Daniel could imagine. By the time they reached the towering glass building downtown, 40 stories of steel, silence, and money, his pulse had settled into a numb rhythm. He was guided through polished hallways, past framed patents and photographs of people who looked like they'd never waited for anything in their lives. When he finally stepped into the conference room, 2 more attorneys were waiting, along with a woman whose expression carried the unmistakable tension of someone used to negotiating winnings, not grieving losses. They invited him to sit. Daniel felt small at the long mahogany table, swallowed by the room's cold elegance. The older attorney cleared his throat and opened a slim folder. "Mr. Reyes, before we proceed, you need to understand who Mrs. Elara Finch truly was." And that's when everything he thought he knew cracked open. Elara Finch was not some quiet, solitary woman surviving on modest means. She was the widow of Adrian Finch, one of the early architects of a groundbreaking tech empire, a man whose innovations reshaped entire industries. After his passing, Elara withdrew from public life, choosing simplicity over spotlight. She had built a life in the shadows, grieving privately, living quietly, and, apparently, observing more than she ever let on. The attorney slid a sealed envelope across the table. Inside was a handwritten letter in Elara's delicate script. She spoke about kindness, about how Daniel's sincerity had reminded her of who Adrian used to be before success devoured him. And she thanked him for noticing her, for helping without obligation, for treating her like a person and not a burden. Then came the second revelation. A check with so many zeros that Daniel blinked twice, thinking it had to be a mistake, followed by documents granting him a meaningful stake in Adrian's company. And finally, access to a private property Elara had kept hidden for years. Before he could process any of it, the woman across the table leaned forward, eyes icy. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she muttered. "We'll be contesting it." Just like that, Daniel realized he had stepped into a world where kindness wasn't just rare. It was resented. The property was nothing like Daniel imagined. After everything he'd heard in that sterile conference room, he expected a mansion or a gated estate patrolled by people in suits. Instead, the car pulled up to a quiet lakeside cottage, the kind of place where time seemed to slow down just to breathe. The porch sagged slightly under its own age, and wind brushed through tall grass like fingers turning pages. When Daniel stepped inside, the scent of old paper and cedar welcomed him with a familiarity he couldn't explain. The cottage was small, 1 main room, a narrow hallway, and a study tucked in the back as if guarding the heart of the home. That study felt alive the moment he opened the door. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains, illuminating shelves filled with journals, photo albums, and delicate trinkets. A typewriter sat on the desk, keys worn from years of stories poured into them. And everywhere, scattered across the surface, were Elara's handwritten notes. Daniel sat in her chair and opened the first journal he touched. Her writing was tender, sometimes shaky, but always thoughtful. She wrote about her husband, the brilliance that made him a legend, and the pressure that slowly consumed the man she loved. She wrote about the silence that followed his death, how it hollowed her days and left her drifting between memory and loneliness. And then, in later entries, she wrote about the restaurant. She described the warmth of the space, the comfort of routine, and the quiet safety she felt watching Daniel navigate his busy shift with kindness people rarely noticed. She wrote about the way he helped her without pity, without hesitation, without expecting anything back. "He reminds me of who Adrian was before the world demanded too much of him," one entry read. "He treats people the way humanity was meant to." As Daniel turned each page, the truth settled deeper into him. His small acts, the ones he never thought twice about, had become the anchor of someone else's healing. And in that study, surrounded by her life's fragments, he realized Alara hadn't chosen him out of impulse. She had chosen him because he unknowingly restored a piece of her faith. They didn't wait long to come after him. Within a week, Daniel found himself sitting across from a long polished table in a conference room that felt colder than any courtroom. On one side sat Alara's distant relatives, people who had never shown up at the diner, never shared a lunch with her, never even called her on holidays. On the other side, two executives from her late husband's company glared at him like he was a stain on their reputation. Their goal was simple: prove he was unworthy and strip him of everything Alara left behind. They attacked quickly. He was a waiter, a nobody. She was clearly confused in her final months. This is exploitation. He must have manipulated her. Daniel's fists tightened under the table, but he kept his voice steady. Instead of arguing, he reached into his bag and set one of Alara's journals on the table. The one she'd written in the clearest handwriting. The one filled with her reasons. He read aloud a passage describing how Daniel's kindness restored her sense of humanity, how she chose him with a sound mind and a full heart. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet where truth settles like a stone dropped into deep water. The relatives squirmed. The executives exchanged stiff glances. Their accusations suddenly had no weight, no foundation. But the challenge wasn't over, only paused. And Daniel could feel the fight sharpening around him, greed gathering strength for its next swing. Daniel didn't cheer when the ruling finally came down in his favor. He didn't pump his fist or celebrate like someone who just won a battle. Instead, he closed his eyes and exhaled, softly, gratefully, because it felt less like a victory and more like a promise he was finally allowed to keep. With the inheritance secured, he knew exactly what to do. Not to impress anyone, not to prove the challengers wrong, but to honor the woman who sat quietly in the corner booth with her notebook, finding comfort in the simplest human gestures. He donated a portion of the money to elderly care foundations, places where people like Alara often slipped through the cracks unnoticed. He funded mobility programs, meal plans, and support initiatives, imagining her smile at the thought of someone else feeling seen. Back at the restaurant, he paid to have her corner repaired and restored. The seat was reupholstered in the warm green she liked, the table refinished until it gleamed. A tiny brass plaque was added to the wall, Alara's Corner, a place for gentle souls. It wasn't flashy, just honest. The rest he used to create something in her name, a community scholarship for young people who worked service jobs while pursuing bigger dreams. She had believed in him without ever saying it outright, and now that belief could ripple outward. Some evenings, after the dinner rush, Daniel would take out her old notebook, the one she carried every day, and sit for a moment in her corner. Not to mourn, but to remember, to keep the echo of her wisdom alive. That small kindness, the kind no one ever expects a reward for, can transform a life in ways you never see coming. And in that quiet space, with the low hum of the restaurant around him, it felt like her final gift was still unfolding. In the end, Daniel's story reminds us that kindness doesn't disappear into the air. It lands somewhere, on someone, often in ways we never realize. A quiet gesture, a moment of patience, a bit of humanity offered with no expectation. Sometimes those are the very things that echo the loudest in someone else's life. Alara saw that in him when he thought no one was looking, and it changed everything. It makes you wonder, what would you have done in Daniel's place?